There it is. Okay, so welcome to, I think, lecture number 12. It's hard to believe that we've lasted this long. I'm going to try to strike a little balance between working through the book in the order it was written, and picking out some really important and some more famous than others, but very famous parts, arguments and ideas that the Rambam expresses later on. So what I decided to do is I'm going to continue for the first like 10-15 minutes. I'm going to continue where we left off and do a term so that we're working through the Rambam, because right now he's going through different Hebrew terms and their translations and how to interpret their meaning. And then after that, I'm going to fast forward to a topic that the Rambam discusses, and I'll tell you which topic I'm going to choose before I read it with you. So where we were up to last time was part 1, chapter 9, and if you recall, Rambam goes through various Hebrew terms and describes how they can mean different things in different contexts. And this is the basic building block for how Rambam is going to interpret many things in the Torah, and that's why this is important. That's why he starts the book like this. So the next term in 9 is the word Kisseh, right? The Hebrew word Kisseh, which literally translates, the best little translation is chair. So if you're in the in Pines, it's on page 34 in the first volume, and it starts a throne or a Kisseh. And I'm gonna read from the Hebrew, translate into English, my loose translation from the Kapach translation. So Iker Hanachaso, the primary translation of the word chair, Kisseh, is Hu Shem HaKisseh. It's the name of a chair. A chair is a Kisseh. Fine. But even Shaloha Yoshim al Kisseh, in the old days, no one sat on chairs. The people that sat on chairs were people that were big leaders, the big shots sat on chairs. Your average person sat on a rock or a log or whatever he found to sit on. So therefore, the Vanasa Hakise Davar Matsui, the chair, became a word of reference to Hamora al Kavod, which are referred to the honor, a person's honor, because only an honorable person sat on a chair in the old days. So therefore, Misha Nasa Bishvilo V'Romuso V'Rumalaso. So the Kisseh came to mean something that was made for a person to signify his honor. Which is why the Mikdash, the temple, the sanctuary, was called Kisseh, when it's referred to Biglal Horaso, because the temple was meant to teach us Al Gedulas, the greatness of the one who is revealed there, the one who's V'Hishresh Naso V'Kro Alav, the one who his holy presence, his divine presence rests there. And therefore, Lekach Amar Kisseh Kavod Marom Merishon, that this is the throne of the honor of the great original creator. So Kisseh happens then now to be referred to a temple. For the same reason, Nikru Hashamayim Kisseh, the heavens are called a Kisseh, a chair. So because someone who looks at the heavens, thinks about the heavens, wonders about the grandness, the vastness, and the beauty of the heavens, will then he will then think about Al Gedulat Mamtziam. He'll think about the greatness of the one who brought those heavens into being, the one who makes the planets and the stars move in the ways that they move. Remember, in the Rambam's eyes, the heavens moved and the earth was stationary, right? So and that great grand creator of this incredible heaven also runs this world in his great goodness. Therefore, when God says the heavens are my throne, right? What does that mean? It doesn't mean that that's where God is. Although in people's minds we have this image, it's so ingrained in us to think God is in heaven. But so way too many people think that there's actually, like, God is up there. But obviously, Rambam is saying, no, God's not up there. We just call heavens the place of God, because when one contemplates the greatness and the vastness of heaven, one comes to recognize the greatness of God. So it's like, just like a chair tells you how great the person who's sitting in that chair, or a throne tells you how great the king is who's sitting in that throne. So and then the Rambam emphasizes, this is what people that know the truth are going to tell you and explain, that not that there is actually a body, God forbid, of God, that God is somehow above that, that this body of God is somewhere all the way up there. That's where he is. Because it has to be clear to you that God there is no body that is God. If there is no body that is God, how could he have a place? Similar to what we said when we translated the word place before. Every place where God's honor is revealed, and his shine and his light is seen, that is special. Any place that you look at and experience the special presence of God, that's considered nikra kisseh, that's considered a chair. However, someone who it says kiyad al kes yad, that if there's a hand on God's chair, that's also a description of God's greatness. And don't ever think, right, that there's a place where God is and then there's a place where God isn't. That would definitely be kfira b'li safek if someone thinks that. So the Rambam is saying here something, it's a very strong statement, that if you even think that there's a place where God is, then by definition, you're saying that there's another place where God isn't. And that's kfira, meaning that is heresy, right? So a person who thinks that heaven is God's place or the temple is God's place is a heretic. And that's a pretty strong statement. That's why it says, you, God, live la'olam, forever. And not only does it mean forever, it means everywhere. Your seat goes from generation to generation. Mashma, meaning that it's something built in nifrad mimenu. It's something that is not separate. There's nothing that's separate from God, because God just is. So lefikach hakavana b'kisei kan, whenever it uses the term kisseh, seat, chair, and any similar phrase to that, it's referring to his greatness and his grandeur. Okay, so that's the Rambam explaining the term kisseh, and you could see how this is very consistent with the way he translated the other terms. So this is where I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna skip forward to somewhere. But before I do that, do I have any questions or comments? I don't want to say anything about the issue of chair. You can go ahead.
I wanted to ask about the idea of God's in one place, it can't be in some other place. How does this square with the Kabbalistic concept of tzimtzum, of God contracting to make room for the world?
Well, first of all, it doesn't square with tzimtzum, and many thinkers have written that Rambam would have considered that concept to be kfira, partly for the very reason, kfira meaning heresy, for the non-Hebrew speakers here, that because of exactly what he just said, Rambam would definitely not have agreed with that. But that's a good point. The concept of tzimtzum being a Jewish Kabbalistic concept, that the creation of the world was an act of God contracting into himself and leaving space out there where little sparks of God remained, and that space out there allowed for the world to be created, for a physical world to exist.
Well, that's the explanation for why there is free will. I'm assuming that at some point we're going to get to a discussion of Rambam's discussion of whether there is or isn't free will.
Yeah,
and how it exists.
We will get to a discussion of that. And Rambam refers to that in many different places in many different ways. But we're about to start something fun. And I'm going to give you a little introduction. And I'm going to go to part 3, book 3, the Chelek Shlishi, Perek Lamed Beis, that's chapter 32. And this is where Rambam discusses an idea that is it's familiar to many people because this is one of the great Jewish philosophers who debated Rambam was the Ramban, Maimonides, and there's a lot of despite Maimonides, right? He who lived about maybe half a century after Rambam, I guess, or maybe a little bit less than a century. But Ramban, while he vigorously debated Rambam on a lot of topics, including the one we're about to study together, he held the Rambam in utmost respect. So he called him the great rabbi. He held him in utmost respect, as opposed to others who disagreed with the Rambam and Maimonides and burned his books and so on and so forth. But the subject we're about to study is the reason why is one of the most controversial things the Rambam said, and you'll understand why as we say it, and why many of the traditionalists really didn't like it. And Ramban was famous for this, and it's a debate. So since people are a little familiar with it, I decided to study it. And it's going to be regarding the question of the reason why God established korbanot, sacrifices, and a temple. Why did God make a temple? And why did he tell us to bring sacrifices? And why did he appoint priests specifically to bring the sacrifices and so on? And but within this, and while that in and of itself is a huge topic and very broad and very important, but it's actually it can be and is a segue into tremendous amount of issues and problems that we deal with when we study through the Torah and try to understand mitzvot of all different kinds, and because it has such tremendous implications, that's why it became so controversial. But at the beginning of it, before he goes into the discussion, he brings a comparison, which really gets me going, and because as a doctor, I happen to personally have a bit of an interest in medical history. And one of the great physicians of all time was a Greek physician / philosopher named Galen of Pergamon, and who lived in the 2nd century Greece, but when Greece was part of the Roman Empire. And I have a book here with a little biography of him that I want to read a chapter about Galen, because Maimonides wrote numerous works, and we still have them today on medicine. As a doctor, he wrote medical treatises, about several volumes, a lot of writings. And Maimonides' medical writings are based on the medicine of Galen. In Hebrew, Galen is known as Galenos. So Maimonides, when he quotes and calls him Galenos, we know him in English as Galen of Pergamon. But anyway, the thing about Galen is that he mixed theology and philosophy with his medicine. So he was the first person to introduce the idea that we should experiment in order to learn about medicine, and that doing experiments can teach us what's actually going on. And he's the first person who decided to do dissections. So he dissected monkeys to determine the anatomy and to determine the function of different parts of the body. And since the Rambam is is going to start this chapter with a nice quote from Galen, I want to tell you a little bit about Galen, because Galen, he basically was the father of the scientific method, pretty much, and came up with the idea of making an experiment, a medical experiment. But then he would get to a point where there was a problem that he couldn't figure out, and the way he would solve the problem was with his theology and his philosophy. So that rather than when he came up with something that made no sense, so on the one hand, he advanced the science of medicine tremendously with his experiments, but on the other hand, he gave sometimes such faulty explanations for certain scientific phenomenon that set medicine back 1,000 years. It wasn't till Andreas Vesalius, and I think the 15th century in Italy, who finally said, we have to answer these questions without, scientifically, and was able to advance medicine beyond Galen. So anyway, Galen, I'm just going to read a paragraph from, this is a book by Sherwin Nuland, as a physician who wrote a lot about medical history. He says here, Galen's biology was made up of a series of contradictions, and so is his life. His career was one long exercise in inconsistency. His trust in a supernatural creator belied his unbiased contributions as a researcher. His often odious personal deportment, because he had a lot of affairs and all kinds of stuff, made a mockery of his self-proclaimed philosophic serenity. He was at once the originator of the experimental method in medical investigation and the obstructing force that inhibited its further development for a millennium and a half after his death. To him, we owe the origin of modern medicine's appreciation of anatomical accuracy as the foundation for the understanding of disease, and upon his abiding influence must be cast the onus of impeding research in anatomy until the 16th century. He was the ancient world's most eloquent proponent of direct observation and planned experiment, and yet he allowed philosophical and theological conjecture to influence his interpretation of what he saw. He was medicine's best influence, and he was its worst. Now, I want you to pay attention now to this first paragraph of chapter 32 in Maimonides, because you're going to see Maimonides doing the same thing that Galen did. Okay, and he's going to quote Galen, and he's going to give a theological explanation for what he saw medically, which is fine. Actually, in this context, it works well because it brings out the point that Maimonides is trying to make. So Maimonides isn't setting science back with this statement, but you can see how Galen's influence and his philosophical explanations for what he found anatomically kind of set science in a stalemate for well over 1,000 years. So here goes the Rambam, Perek 32. Again, I'm reading from the Hebrew, and I'm going to translate, and I'm reading from Kapach's Hebrew translation. If you think about God's creations, Kilomar, Hamasim Hativim, God's natural creations, you can see how clearly God's wisdom in his creations and how he created things on this world. And how the order of the movement of limbs and how the one limb being next to the other limb being next to the other limb, they're just juxtaposition next to each other is so important. So, and then you would also become clear the incredible wisdom and how God guides the world, one situation after another. Let me give you an example, Maimonides says. And then Maimonides is taking almost a direct quote out of Galen's, one of Galen's works in Latin, De Usu Partium Humani Corporis, one of Galen's books on human anatomy, which, by the way, he got mostly from dissecting monkeys. So the first and what Galen figured out, and this is something that no one knew until Galen came around, that the brain was attached to the spinal cord, which was attached to the nerves, which was attached to the muscles, right? So for the first time, Galen recognized that the neurological system is what makes us move. Now, to us today, that sounds incredible, but Galen figured that out through his anatomical analysis. And one of his experiments was severing the spinal cord of a monkey and seeing that made it paralyzed from waist down. So he realized that there's some communication from up here that gets blocked when you sever the spinal cord. That was one of his experiments. So, but the thing that they didn't understand was that they thought that the brain was making movements that were transmitted down. The idea that that was like a continuum from the brain all the way through to the muscles to the bones. So listen to how the Rambam understands this. In the way things, the limbs are next to each other. Starting hamoach with the brain, the beginning where the movements start in the front of the brain is rach. It's very soft, right? And then as it goes through the rear of the brain and you're getting close to the spinal cord, it's getting a little harder. And this is true. When you get from this to the cerebellum, it's a little bit more firm, the tissue. Ubena pulin yosamach. And then when you get, to the what they call the cerebellum, the pulin, which is the which are like kind of like hard bean shaped, are even more hard. And then as it goes down the spinal cord, it gets more and more firm. However, I'm going to go to the I'm going to go back to the pines. This is on chapter 32. This is page in volume 2. This is page 525. The spinal marrow is even more solid and becomes more and more solid as you go down the spine. Then the nerves which exit the spine, these are the organs of sensation and of motion. Accordingly, the nerves required only for the apprehension by the senses or for motion. So they understood that the nerves also do sensation. These were also based on Galen's experiments in the 2nd century by cutting nerves that we lose sensation. That presents with a little difficulty, the motions of the eyelids or the jaws that proceed from the brain, whereas the motions required for moving the limbs, because they didn't see the muscles in these things that are close to the brain. So those movements were just straight from the brain. They didn't realize that there was little nerves that go from the brain to the eyes too. But however, it is impossible for a nerve, because it's still too soft, even the nerves that are coming out of the spine, to make something move. So therefore, the matter was wily here, intelligently and graciously arranged, that the nerves go into little fibers. Eventually, those fibers become flesh and they become muscle, which is more firm than the nerves and stronger than the nerves, because they didn't realize that the nerves communicate with the muscles, right, and tell the muscles to move. They saw it as a continuum where the nerves eventually become muscle, right? Thereupon the nerve, having overpassed the extremity of the muscle, having become more solid, and then it becomes, the muscle becomes ligaments and becomes a tendon, and then the tendon goes to the bone. So it's getting harder and harder and harder all the way till you get to bone. And now the nerve is capable of making that limb, the bone, move. So it starts something really, really soft up here. It gets firmer and firmer and stronger and stronger and stronger as you get closer until it's actually able to move. I mentioned only this one example to you because it is the most obvious of the wonders explained in the treatise. And here he quotes Galen's book on the utilities of the parts of the body, right? All of which wonders are clear, manifest, and well known to those who consider them with a penetrating mind. So here's where he jumps from anatomy to physiology, right? To philosophy and theology, right? Taking that all of that and saying, this is how the world works, right? Similarly, the deity, when God made an arrangement in his world with the a smart and wonderful arrangement with regard to all individuals of all living things that suck. Well, here he goes another analogy, that nurse. For when they're born, such individuals, the baby is very soft and can't eat dry food. So he has to start off with something soft. So the breasts are very soft and they produce milk, which is very soft, and they take the food, and then eventually the bodies get stronger and stronger. So then this next chapter. So the idea being as follows: you lay down this idea from looking at anatomy and for looking at a baby nursing. You have to start off soft, and you can get harder and harder and harder until you get where you really want to get, which is the movement. Okay. All that being said, now let's jump to theology and philosophy. Many things in our law, and meaning the Torah, right, are due to something similar to this very governance on the part of him who governs. May he be glorified and exalted. Right? When God gave us the Torah, he did it in a similar fashion. For a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible. If the human being can't all of a sudden be A and then all of a sudden be thrown all the way to Z, it's impossible. It doesn't work. Therefore, man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he was accustomed. If a person is accustomed to living in a certain culture and a certain background with certain mores and certain ethics and certain ways of practice and certain ways of relating to things, you can't all of a sudden expect him to change everything completely 360. As therefore God sent Moses, our master, to make us a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God had a goal to make us a holy nation, but in the meantime, we weren't. We were a bunch of pagans like everybody else. So how's he going to make the people of Israel into a nation of kingdom of priests and a holy nation? Through the knowledge of him, it's going to come through the knowledge of God. May he be exalted. Accordingly to what he has explained, saying, unto thee it was shown that thou mightest that I might know, and so on. Know this day and lay it to heart, and so on. In other words, God was teaching us all of these things and telling us, right, what our ultimate goal is going to be. And so that we should devote ourselves to his worship, according to what he said, and to serve him with all your heart. Right? And you shall serve the Lord your God, right? And him you shall serve. So the point, so he's taking a nation of pagans, and he's making us eventually into a kingdom of where the ultimate goal is worshiping God, which is a long, far cry away from the pagan lifestyle. As at that time, the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world, and the universal service upon which we were brought up, right? The entire world and us ourselves consisted in offering various species of living beings. The way they worshiped was to take various living beings, animals, into the temples in which the images were set up, where they had images of the gods, in worshiping the latter, worshiping those images, and in burning incense before them. And the pious ones, the ones who were special in front of those gods, and the ascetics, the spiritual ones, being at that time, as we explained, the people who were devoted to the service of the temples, who were consecrated to the stars. That's what they did. That's how people worshiped God. That was how we were raised. That's what we did. So therefore, in his wisdom may he be exalted, and his gracious ruse, right, which is manifest in regard to all his creatures, did not require that he give us a law prescribing the rejection, abandonment, and abolition of all these kinds of worship. God didn't come to us and say, don't bring sacrifices at all. Don't worship God in that same way at all. Don't have certain people that are designated as the holy ones that teach, and so on, right? For one could not then conceive the acceptance of such a law. People would not have been able to accept the Torah had God done that right away. Considering the nature of man, which it always likes that to which it is accustomed. That's not how human beings are. That's not how nature is. Just like in his analogy, the brain is to start off soft and eventually become firm after going through a lot of stages. Human beings have to go through stages to get from A to Z. They can't just jump straight there. At that time, this would have been similar to the appearance of a prophet in these times, who calling upon people to worship God would say, God has given you a law forbidding you to pray to him, to fast. This is hinting, the Rambam is saying that I'm not big on petitionary prayer, okay? So we know Rambam was not big on the idea of praying to God for things. So Rambam is dropping hints here. If a prophet were to come to you to say, and don't pray to God for help when you're sick. Don't pray to God for help when you can't find a job. What the Rambam believed prayer is, he's going to drop us a lot of hints, but here's one of those places. Or to fast, which we even have references in the Talmud that fasting it might be a way to help bring people to the mood and emotion that they need in order to properly appreciate God, or to call upon him for help in misfortune. Your worship should consist solely in meditation without any works. Don't do anything, just be holy, or just meditate and come to intellectual heights and levels of understandings of God. Therefore, so because God couldn't say Z, because we were still at A, so he may be exalted, suffered the above mentioned kinds of worship to remain. He said, you know what? You can still do that kind of low-level prayer. You can still do that even lower level with sacrifices. But he transferred them from created or imaginary and unreal things to his own name. He said, you know what? Just don't do it to all those idols. Remember that there's one God and it's me, and I'm the one you to pray to. Commanding us to practice them with regard to him. Thus he commanded us to build a temple for him, then make me a sanctuary, to have an altar for him, make an altar of earth to make unto me, to have the sacrifice offered to him, when any man of you bringeth an offering unto the Lord, to bow down and worship before him, to burn incense before him. And he forbade the performance of any of these actions with the view to someone else. He that sacrifices unto the gods shall be utterly destroyed, and so on. And because of their employment, and he singled out priests for the service, so that they may minister unto me in the priest's office. Because in Rambam's real world, there's no distinction between one person and another. This is another hint the Rambam is dropping here now. In Rambam's scheme, it doesn't matter who you are, what family you were born into, whether you're Jewish or not, right? In Rambam's world, everyone has the same access, right? But God had to say, I'm going to make priests, and because they're employed in the temple, I'll fix them dues so they can be supported on them. Through this divine ruse, it was basically a divine trick, right? It came about the memory that the memory of idolatry would efface. We see it worked, because through this path, God got idols out of our system, right? Eventually it worked. Paganism basically was relegated to ancient history. And the grandest and true foundation of belief, namely the existence and oneness of the deity, the fact that there is only one God, was firmly established, while at the same time, the souls had no feeling of repugnance and were not repelled because of the abolition of the modes of worship to which they had been accustomed, and that which no other mode of worship was known at that time. So you can understand why this can land as a bomb on someone who takes before the Rambam knows that this statement is going to be a major bomb, and that a lot of people are not going to like it. And he's about to deal with his anticipated attacks. He's going to deal with that in the next paragraph. But before I go on, I want to pull some comments, see what you guys want to say about this so far.
Well, it makes the Jewish people somewhat lesser stature. We've heard it's can't you trust us, God? Just give us the truth, and we'll go along. You don't have to fool us.
Yeah, that's excellent. Rambam was going to say that. The next time, it's exactly what he's going to say. That why don't people are just going to, you're going to ask me, Rambam says, why couldn't he just, fast forward, tell us the truth right away? But exactly, it makes us realize that we weren't so great back then. Yeah, but excellent, good point. Anyone else want to say something else so far?
I just have a question, which is, if he sees this as a progression from pagan forms of worship that transition over time, what are his thoughts on the future? That is he one that holds that there will not be sacrifices again in a rebuilt temple? What does that do for his Musaf prayers?
Yeah, so that's actually Ramban's, Maimonides' major objection to this, because if you carry this to its logical conclusion, then there won't be sacrifices in the future. Now, and the biggest issue is, on the one hand, you could say that Rambam felt that there won't be sacrifices in the future, and bring it to its logical conclusion. The problem with that is that contradicts an entire, I have 14 volumes of Maimonides' Yad HaChazaka on my shelf here that attest repeatedly over and over again that there's going to be a temple with sacrifices when the Mashiach comes, right? So yeah, you could say the Rambam contradicted himself, but the bottom line is that so, and we'll see later, the Rambam did not really necessarily take this to its logical conclusion. So therein lies the biggest danger here, right? The danger to orthodoxy, right? Because if you draw this to its conclusion, then you're saying that there won't be sacrifices, and that the Torah was given. Well, I don't want to say this. I want to let someone else make a point. But I think, did that answer your question? The bottom line is he doesn't say it outright, and what he meant, did he mean for us to take it to its logical conclusion? I'm not going to answer that question. I'll let you answer that. And as we learn through the more Nevuchim, more and more and more, you'll decide on your own, But any other comments?
Well, it goes much further than just sacrifices. It could be anything where we shake our heads today learning anything in Gemara, which is like patently archaic and only context bound in their times. You could take the same principle and logic and say, well, that too is clearly a concession to the local and the time-bound, practices. And today we're much more enlightened. So it's a very slippery slope across the board.
Yeah, it's very much slippery slope, and Maimonides attacked the Rambam because of that. But there's other places where we like the slippery slope. I'm going to give you a good example. I heard this very beautifully and eloquently from Jonathan Sachs, and I'll give another example from my son who's listening to this, who's on this podcast, on this cast right now. Rabbi Sachs used this often when he talked about the Torah's strictures on slavery, right? Because nowadays slavery is repugnant to all of us. But some people try to justify slavery and say, oh, look, the Torah says it's okay to have slaves, right? So Rabbi Sachs used to explain, and not just him, a lot of people wrote these ideas, but he very eloquently brought it out and said, the Torah was in a world where slavery was acceptable and parcel of society. It couldn't just be knocked out right away. So the Torah restricted it. It says, you know what, if you have a slave, don't hit him, treat him right, make sure he has food to eat. When you send him free, give him a packet. You can't enslave him forever, so on, to restrict the practice so that we should learn eventually to get to the point where we treat everyone with freedom. And then you start quoting the various verses throughout Tanakh that talk about the importance of freedom, and we like when Yirmiyahu told everyone to free their slaves, and we see other indicators of that. My son, who is vegan, he said he and I had this discussion. I could apply the same argument to the kosher laws, right? Maybe God really wants us not to eat animals at all, right? But he told us, if you kill them in a certain way, slaughter them. Don't eat all animals. Only eat certain animals that are known to be prey animals that are, but and don't mix meat and milk, and don't, like all these strictures that are only necessary to limit, don't eat the blood, respect the animal, don't eat Aver min achai, so that we can eventually get to the point. It's a good argument for that. So you can apply it in lots of places. Some of it are slippery slope things that okay, so now all the Torah laws are out the window. So some of it could be very problematic, but some of them are really nice. So that you get a lot of advantages, a lot of ways to understand the Torah, and you get a lot of problems too. Does that make sense?
It seems like the sages of the time gets the Das Torah, as we might say, to make those kinds of adjudications in that, just like he was considered somewhat heretical in his time, compared to, hundreds of years before him. So too, today, we would have people who could reasonably look at a light switch or the space shuttle and say, okay, this is what the contemporary equivalent is, and here's the decision, and I'm paskening on that basis. So I guess in each era, there's going to be those sort of, I don't know what word to use, chachamim, who are able to make that kind of bold decision. You could argue we don't have people like that today, but that I think would probably be the formula to try and keep everything current and contemporary.
Yeah. Yep. But
well, both Rabbi Sachs and Yitz Greenberg make precisely the argument about vegetarianism that you've articulated.
Yeah, and there's good reason to believe that Rav Kook, the first Rav Kook, Rav Yitzchak Cohen Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, there's hints in his writing that he believed that the sacrifices that will be brought in the third temple are going to be vegetarian sacrifices. We do know that he himself, what?
A number of years ago, I brought Rabbi Sachs to Beth Shalom as a scholar, and on Friday he had told us in advance that he would only eat fish and not meat. During dinner, he said that fish for him was transition, that he was hoping to get to the point where he didn't even eat fish. Yeah,
there are many examples of rabbis in the that moved towards veganism, or actually were. One of the famous was one of Rabbi Kook's famous top students, who was known as the Nazir, David Cohen, who actually his son was my teacher in Israel. I learned for smicha under him, and he for rabbinic ordination. And he was a vegan. The Nazir Cohen, who's Rabbi Kook's student, who was a vegan, and also believed that in the future we were going to be vegan. So he also believed that the Torah was basically aiming in that direction, and that would be an extension of this Maimonidean philosophy, that the kosher rules were designed. Some people look at the kosher rules and say, see, the Torah says we can eat meat, but maybe the point of the Torah's rules were in order to wean us away from it. Maybe the reason why the Torah said you can't eat this animal, you can't, because you know what, to be honest, every time people try to explain by the way, this chapter here is in the context of all the chapters of the Rambam that talk about the reasons for the mitzvot, the reasons why the Torah said this and this and this. And this is what the Rambam's discussion of the reason for the carbonot. So in that context, the Rambam says this, which gives us more permission to go and try to apply the same reason to other mitzvot, like the kosher laws. The Rambam, who lived in a time when veganism, vegetarianism was just not a thing, right? didn't apply. He came up for other reasons for kosher, which we'll hopefully get to at one point. But none of those other reasons ever worked. You know, now people say, oh, you can't eat pigs because they're dirty, they wallow in the mud, they have various diseases. But you know what? Cows have diseases and sheep have diseases, and they all basically wander in the mud. You know, that's what animals do. So it's none of those reasons are real. None of them have withstood the test of time. But this reason works. I'm gonna, if someone else wants to say something, go ahead. Otherwise, I'll read the next paragraph and then we'll call it a night. If I do read the next paragraph, then we'll get the connection to Pesach, to Passover, which is coming up soon, and the Exodus. So the next chapter is, I know that I'm thinking about this. So it's interesting how Rambam is now talking to you and me. He's directing his words to you in singular. The Hebrew words here, and I assume the Arabic as well, he's talking to, I know, oh, you're jumping at me now, right? And this is what Jeffrey was saying before. And that I know that I'm thinking about this. At first, your soul will necessarily have a feeling of repugnance towards this notion and will feel aggrieved because of it. And you will ask me in your heart and say to me, how is it possible that none of the commandments, prohibitions, and the great actions, which are very precisely set forth and prescribed fixed seasons? I mean, God wrote page after page of laws and rules, when you bring this and when you bring that and how you bring this and where you bring that, etc., should be intended for its own sake, but for the sake of something else, as if this were some kind of a ruse invented for our benefit by God in order to achieve his first intention. What was there to, are you telling me that all of this was just a trick? What was there to prevent him, may he be exalted, from giving us a law in accordance with his first intention and from procuring us the capacity to accept it? So if God wanted us to accept it, and you're going to tell me what? We weren't capable of doing it as human beings? So make us capable, right? God made human beings. If he wants human beings to be capable of achieving the ultimate goal, then make us capable. Why did he say you have to go through all of this joke to get there? In this way, there would have been no need for the things you consider to be due to second intentions. He wouldn't have needed to do all this trickery stuff to get us there. Here then the reply to your question that will put an end to this sickness in your heart and reveal to you the true reality of that which have drawn your attention. This is a problem, Maimonides is saying, and the problem, the roots of this problem, and this is me talking for a moment, is in what you just said, that if he wanted us to be that way, why didn't he just make us that way? That's the answer. Therein lies the answer. The answer is God wants, he created a world so that we go through this process. That's how the world is. God is not changing the world around. He made this world this way, and he needs for us to live through the process of this world. So so that's the sickness that we have. He's not going to, so it is to the effect that the text of the Torah tells quite a similar story, namely in its dictum. And here we go to the story of the Exodus, where it says, God led them not by the way of the land of the Philistines, right? When they were running out of Egypt, right? He could have taken the short route. If you look at a map, you go to Egypt, you cut across the Mediterranean, you can get to Israel in no time. Instead, he had them wander through the Sinai desert for 40 years, right? So why didn't he take us the straight way? But God led the people about by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. Just as God perplexed them in anticipation of what their bodies were naturally incapable of bearing, why did he not take them directly to the promised land? Because he turned them away from the high road toward which they had been going toward another road, so that the first intention should be achieved. So did he, anticipation of what the soul is naturally incapable of receiving, prescribe the laws that we have mentioned so that the first intention should be achieved, that we had to go through the process of these laws in order to get there. Because for just as it is not in the nature of man, that after having been brought up in a slavish service, they were slaves in Egypt, occupied with clay, bricks, and similar things, that he should all of a sudden wash off the dirt of slavery from them and proceed immediately to fight against the children of Anak, in other words, Amalek. And so it is all, they can't immediately be free people. You can't immediately expect them to form a nation. People of a slave mentality can't suddenly defend themselves against enemies, can't suddenly establish a nation in a land. They have to go through a process. So it is also not his nature that after having been brought up in very many modes of worship and customary practices, which souls find so agreeable that they become, as it were, a primary notion, that he should abandon them all of a sudden. And just as the deity used a gracious ruse in causing them to wander perplexedly in the desert until their souls became courageous, it being well known that life in the desert and lack of comforts for the body necessarily develop courage. So now they'll be able to stand up for themselves, right? Whereas the opposite circumstances necessarily develop cowardice, that if everything is all cool and God just makes you capable so that you can just walk into the land and conquer it, and he makes you capable without you going through the process of learning those strengths and gaining that courage, right? Then you can't do that, right? He's not going to make us that way. We have to go through the process of becoming that way. And until, moreover, people were born who were not accustomed to humiliation and servitude, right, of slavery, that slave mentality, there had to be a generation of children born in freedom. All this having been brought about by Moses, our master, by means of the divine commandments. At the commandment of the Lord, they encamped. At the commandment of the Lord, they journeyed. At the commandment of the Lord, by the hand of Moses. It was with the guidance of God and God alone. That's true freedom, the guidance of God and God alone, not your slave master, not your overlord. So too did this group of laws derive from a divine grace. This was God doing us a favor, right? So that they should be left with the kinds of practices to which they're accustomed, so that those people can first get that notion out of their mind that there are other gods and focus and say, you know, I don't bring sacrifices to this God, that God, depends on which day I want to get which favor, but only one God, there's only one place to go, so that he can finally learn that lesson, so that they should be left with the kind of practices to which they are accustomed, so that they consequently believe with constitutes the first attention should be validated in them, so that eventually they'll get to the notion of true monotheism. So that was the relationship to Pesach, the upcoming holiday. So I'm glad we got there. There's a lot more the Rambam says on this topic, but I'll stop here and I'll open the floor for questions, because we'll continue next time. I'll start again. The first 10-15 minutes, I'll do a term. So we keep moving through the book, and then I'll continue this, because this will probably take us at least one more session, maybe two, because he goes into this in more, in a lot more detail. All right, now I'm opening the floor.
Where does he get this idea from?
He doesn't say.
This was a ruse. I mean, is there some, does he pull it out of the Talmud? Where does he come up with this idea?
I don't know. There might be scholars that will tell you where, but I can tell you for sure that the influence that this has had on Jewish philosophy, religious philosophy, understanding the Bible and the Torah in Judaism and in every religion and every religious thinker that followed after the Rambam, this idea became extremely important, to say the least. Whether important because people hated it or loved it, it became a predominant idea in interpreting the Torah. And where he got it from, I mean, there must be scholars that could figure out, but it certainly was him that was the first major philosopher to make this, to set it out in such a clearly defined way and put it out there. This is just one of the many examples of how influential the Rambam was in religious thought. Anyone else?
It's a great tidbit for the Seder. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, this is really important, and I would recommend that, and I'll send out the reference where the Maimonides, the Ramban, who attacks the Rambam on this idea, and it's in Vayikra, in the beginning of Leviticus, the Maimonides commentary. Maybe I'll try to remember to send out a link to the Ramban on Sefaria so people can read it. But and he goes into a totally different explanation of sacrifices. But who won the debate? I guess that depends who you ask.
Well, I would like to just say that I've been in the belief for a very long time that God is not only in a building or a church, what you started with earlier, and that God is everywhere on earth with us all, even in the moments of our lowest points. He's still there with us, waiting on us to turn to him at any moment. So that was a nice reassurance that it's not just me or the beliefs that I've grown up in that are based in that. That's pretty nice. And also I've spoken with you before about how I believe that true science honest, true science that's accurate actually backs up the beliefs that we have in God, and that true facts actually prove to God and point to the idea that there was an intelligent designer and that we were designed by something, not just by chance or by a random happening. So
Yeah, well, I want to point out that when I mentioned that Galen's mistake was applying his theology to his anatomic science, I didn't mean that it's a mistake to say that there's a contradiction between science and theology. That's not what I meant to say at all. I was saying that that because when you're doing science, you have to look to, you have to look to your experiment to answer, you know what I mean? Rather
sure,
than right.
And I think you kind of also touched on that again later when you were saying that we don't just go from A to Z instantly. All things in life, all things related to life on Earth, from birth to death, and from conception of an idea or religion to the understanding of God's true will and design. You don't just get there all at once. So
Yeah.
Again, sometimes the science is wrong, sometimes our understanding of God is wrong, but the idea is that when you really get the truth, when you really get to the facts of either one, they back each other up. They confirm the truth in each other. And that's something I've always believed, and the more that I study, the more that I reach out to learn more, the more that I'm reassured that that's correct. And it's pretty nice.
Good. Thank you. Anyone else want to add comment on what we learned tonight? If not, I will call it a night, and hopefully, so let me tell you, next week, Wednesday, I'll be on a plane on my way to the Holy Land, going to visit my son and spend Pesach there. So next Wednesday night and the following Wednesday, I won't be here. And so there's going to be 2 weeks that I'm gone. And then the week after, we'll start up again. Okay.
Nice. Look forward to seeing you again.
All right. Thank
Be
you.
safe on your trip.
Pesach.
Thank you. Have a wonderful Pesach, everybody.
Wonderful
Thank
Pesach.
you.
Thanks.